Star Trek, Picard would have been a Borg show if Patrick Stewart didn't return. Jonathan Del Arco reveals Star Trek. Picard would have been a Borg spin-off show if Patrick Stewart didn't return as Admiral Jean-Luc Picard. Star Trek. Picard ran for 3 seasons on Paramount Plus from 2020 to 2023. Picard had 3 different sets of showrunners, from Michael Chabon in Season 1, to Akiva Goldsman and Terry Matalas in Season 2, to Matalas running Season 3 solo to great acclaim. Along with Jean-Luc, the Borg were part of every season of Star Trek. Picard the Borg originated in Star Trek: The Next Generation, with Jonathan Del Arco guest starring as Hugh in TNG's Season 5 episode, I, Borg. Del Arco reprised Hugh, a Borg drone separated from the collective and adopting a personal identity, in TNG Season 6 and 7's Descent 2-parter. Jonathan returning as Hugh in Star Trek Picard 27 years later was a welcome surprise. However, Hugh's story was underserved by Star Trek Picard Season 1 and abruptly ended when Hugh was unceremoniously killed by the Romulan Zhat Vash villain Nerissa Peyton List. Star Trek Picard was originally designed as a Borg show without Patrick Stewart. In an interview with Trek Movie, Jonathan Del Arco explains that before Patrick Stewart agreed to return and Star Trek Picard was created as a series for him, Star Trek was developing a Borg spin-off series. Showrunner James Duff was working with Star Trek executive producer Alex Kurtzman to develop a Borg spin-off, with Del Arco contacted to return as Hugh, as well as Jerry Ryan in talks to reprise 7 of 9 from Star Trek Voyager. Read Del Arco's quote below. James was the showrunner on The Closer and Major Crimes, and a very dear friend of mine and Jerry Ray's, and he had been hired to come very early on, one of the early executive producers and writers of a spin-off of Star Trek. We didn't know what it was. There was no Picard yet. It was a spin-off of Star Trek. Alex Kurtzman, James Duff, and I believe maybe one other writer was involved at the time, and James really wanted it to be a Borg spin-off. That's why he talked to Jerry and I, and really started talking to them about it being this Borg storyline. And somewhere within that he discussed it with us maybe a year before it even happened. And they didn't have Patrick yet. So I think then they went and made the pitch to Patrick. But had Patrick not done it, some kind of show about the Borg would have happened. It would not have been Picard, it would have been a show about the Borg. And you can even tell how heavily Borg influenced it was. So the Borg was really the kernel, from what I understand of the beginning of that idea. And once Patrick became involved, the pieces began to fall into place, and we were set up and given deals to come be a part of the show. At this point in 2018, Star Trek on CBS All Access, about to rebrand as Paramount Plus, was beginning to expand following the success of Star Trek Discovery. Star Trek Picard was the next series announced that went into production, but Jonathan Del Arco clarifies that a Borg-centric project was in the works before Patrick Stewart signed on to play Jean-Luc Picard again. However, if Star Trek Picard never happened, it's not clear if the Borg series would have gone ahead. It is obvious, however, that Borg ideas planned for the spin-off were incorporated into Star Trek Picard, since Jean-Luc has a long history with the Borg. Killing off Hugh was a big Star Trek Picard mistake. Jonathan Del Arco is rightfully disappointed that Star Trek Picard Season 1 killed off Hugh, and he's correct that this decision denied Hugh and Star Trek fans moments they wanted to see. In Picard Season 1, Hugh was the director of the Borg reclamation project on the artifact. Hugh found himself caught trying to project the Borg from the Romulans, who were plotting against Dr. Soji Asha, Issa Briones. As Del Arco told Trek Movie, the choice to abruptly kill Hugh meant he couldn't share scenes with Jerry Ryan or LeVar Burton's Commodore Geordi LaForge. Star Trek Picard would have been a Borg show if Patrick Stewart didn't return. When the announcement of Star Trek Picard first hit the science fiction world, fans across the globe were electrified at the prospect of seeing one of the franchise's most beloved characters return to the screen. Jean-Luc Picard, the wise and principled captain of the USS Enterprise D, had been a figure of reverence since his debut in Star Trek: The Next Generation. For many, his return in Picard was not just a nostalgic opportunity, but a chance to explore the character's development, especially in light of his traumatic past experiences, such as his brief assimilation into the Borg collective as Locutus. However, little did fans know that, had Patrick Stewart not agreed to reprise his iconic role, Picard would have been a very different show, one that focused far more heavily on the Borg and their legacy within the Star Trek universe. The idea of a Star Trek series centered around the Borg has been a tantalizing one for many fans. As one of the franchise's most terrifying and enduring villains, the Borg represent the ultimate existential threat, a collective, hive-minded species that strips away individuality and absorbs entire civilizations into its soulless machine. A show focusing entirely on the Borg would be a deep dive into one of Star Trek's most philosophically rich and chilling antagonists. And in a world without Patrick Stewart, Star Trek Picard could have evolved into just that, a show about the relentless march of Borg expansion, the people they assimilate, and the survivors left in their wake. In fact, the Borg's history with Captain Picard already lays the groundwork for such a direction. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, the Borg were introduced as an almost unstoppable force in the episode Q Who. However, it was in the famous two-parter, The Best of Both Worlds, where Picard's personal connection to the Borg became cemented in Star Trek lore. When the Borg kidnapped Picard and assimilated him, transforming him into Locutus, it was not just a strategic move on their part, but also a violation of his very essence. Even after Picard was rescued and returned to humanity, the trauma of his time as a Borg lingered. His assimilation represented the ultimate loss of control, being forced to act as a spokesperson for an alien species that cared nothing for his individuality or principles. Had Stewart declined to return for Star Trek Picard, it's entirely possible that the show's creative team would have focused on the Borg as a central narrative engine. Without Picard at the center, the writers might have expanded on the Borg's lore, diving deeper into the machinations of the collective, its ongoing evolution, and perhaps even more stories about the recovery and rehabilitation of individuals who managed to escape assimilation. A show that focused on the Borg would have allowed for a different kind of storytelling. Whereas Picard has largely been character-driven, exploring Picard's later life, his regrets, and his relationships with those around him, a Borg-centered show would have emphasized broader, more thematic explorations of identity, control, and freedom. It might have followed new characters who had been assimilated by the Borg and later freed, like Voyager's 7 of 9 or Hugh, who also appears in Picard. These characters, already rich with history, could have been the protagonists of a Borg series, wrestling with the aftermath of their time in the collective and the ongoing threat the Borg posed to the galaxy. One compelling direction such a show could have taken is exploring the cultural and ideological clash between the Borg and Federation values. The Federation represents an optimistic future where diverse individuals from across the galaxy come together to solve problems through diplomacy, exploration, and science. The Borg, on the other hand, are the antithesis of that ideal. Their goal is to assimilate all cultures and species, erasing their individuality in the process. A show centered on the Borg could have explored how this fundamental conflict plays out on a galactic scale, delving into the resistance movements, alliances formed to fight back against Borg incursions, and even the possibility of reforming or dismantling the collective from within. Such a show would also provide room to explore how the Borg have evolved since their initial appearances in The Next Generation and Voyager. In Picard, the Borg are not as monolithic and invincible as they once seemed. In fact, their status is somewhat diminished, with remnants of the collective being harvested and experimented upon by various groups. A Borg-centered series could have explored this new status quo more deeply, how a once powerful species grapples with decline, and what new threats might arise in the vacuum left by the Borgs,